what's going on, AP World? We have Chapter 3 of Alan Brinkley's American History, Society, and Culture in Provincial America. All right, let's talk about the colonial population to start off. And we have indentured servants, a very important concept to understand. Now, in the Chesapeake region, stop. Do you remember what the two colonies were that made up the Chesapeake? You said Maryland and Virginia. You are correct. Three-quarters of the immigrants to the Chesapeake area in the 17th century were indentured servants, and they served for unusual, at average, as I mentioned, about 4 to 5 years, sometimes as high as 7, really depending on the individual contract. Factors that promoted indentured servants: the population did not make good laborers. Unfortunately, for many Native Americans, as high as 90% in some areas of Native Americans died from disease. They also knew the land and were able to run away. We also had the headright system, which is roughly 50 acres of land given to people to pay for the passage of an indentured servant. And something that leads to the decline of indentured servants after a little while. Hopefully, you know this from last chapter, you remember it. It is Bacon's Rebellion. That is huge. Any essay talking about slavery has to talk about Bacon's Rebellion because the decline in indentured servants helped lead to an increase in slavery. And indentured servants would become free, as we saw in Bacon's Rebellion, after about 4 to 5 years, whereas slaves never would gain their freedom. So again, I cannot stress enough, Bacon's Rebellion led to the decline of indentured servants. All right, let's talk about women and families in the colonies. In the Chesapeake, again, focusing on Virginia and Maryland, there was a very high mortality rate, and this affected traditional families. There was a very high birth rate as well. Married women every 2 years would have a child, and it was not uncommon for a married woman to have 11 or 12 different children. In New England, the family is going to be much more stable. The mortality rates were much lower up there. People lived longer. They were close-knit families that were common. You would often see grandparents, whereas in the Chesapeake, you may not. And Puritanism in New England played a very large role in the daily life, as it did not just for women, but for most citizens, especially in Massachusetts. So what are the similarities between the two regions? Well, in each region, they had fewer rights than men, especially if they were married. They were forced to give up their property, and they also had many children as well. Okay, so we established that Bacon's Rebellion leads to an increase in slavery, but let's talk a little bit more about slavery. 11 million Africans were forced to come to the Americas as slaves. I want you to think about that number, 11 million. That is astonishingly high. They traveled on what was known as the Middle Passage, which was kind of a leg in the triangular trade. This was just a horrific passage. And in the mid-1690s, the Royal African Company of England lost their monopoly on the slave trade. So now that you can have more people trading, you will see slavery increase quite drastically in the 1690s. So Bacon's Rebellion happens about 15 years before this, 20 years before this, and then you have the end of the monopoly for the Royal African Company, which leads to an increase in the slave trade in the Americas. And we have slave codes, which is something we'll see in the South throughout American history to the Civil War. And these are laws that regulated the behavior of slaves, things like forbidding them from reading and writing, testifying in court, etc. We also have a changing source of European immigration. We have French, German, Irish, and Scottish who begin to emigrate in large numbers to the Americas. And one of the reasons we have the Edict of Nantes, which allowed Huguenots, which were French Protestants. Now, France is predominantly a Catholic country. The Edict of Nantes allowed Huguenots to practice their religion. That should say no S on there. We have Germans settling in Pennsylvania, and the Scots-Irish, please know this for the future, settled in North Carolina, or what is present-day North Carolina, especially on the frontier. So in this frontier is this idea of like the wilderness, basically. And Scots-Irish settled in North Carolina. Many of them came from the province of Ulster, including and they made up the largest group of immigrants in the 18th century. And a very famous person of Scots-Irish descent is this guy, Andrew Jackson. Okay, we're going to talk about similarities, economic similarities between the regions. Farming is common throughout. You're going to need food. Trade with natives was also common throughout as a way to make money. In the southern economy, it's dominated by plantations and cash crops, in this case tobacco, which is a crop raised to sell and make money. More tobacco equals more land equals more expansion equals conflict with Native Americans, and it goes on and on and on and on. Now, we do have a couple times throughout history where there is overproduction and lack of a demand, and we see this in the 1640s. In Georgia and South Carolina, we see them predominantly growing rice early on. And rice fields, rice paddies were incredibly hard work. It was not a fun job whatsoever, and this is where slaves were really treated harshly. I mean, they were treated harshly everywhere, but especially here is very, very hard work. Harsh conditions, and many whites refused to do this, which ultimately helped lead to an increase in slavery. South Carolina also grew indigo, which was important for a dye in clothing. And farms and plantations dominated the South, so you do not see these large cities, at least for at the time, these large cities develop like we do in New England. Lots of spread out land and plantation owners. The northern economic and technological life is dominated by things like a lack of large scale farming. It did not develop in New England. It was very rocky terrain. It's a colder climate. The middle counties, especially New York and Pennsylvania, produce lots of wheat, so they produce food for lots of different areas. And the commercial economy was important. Lots of trade going on, especially in New England. Some new industries that began to develop by the mid 17th century were lumber, mining, fishing, and shipbuilding. So you see lots of commerce, lots of industry begin to build in the north, again, especially in New England and port cities. A very important term that I want you guys to be familiar with is specie here, and specie is underlined because it's that important. Specie simply means gold or silver, and we'll see this again and again throughout American history. Now, most colonists did not have gold or silver. That was often shipped to England or the mother country. So commerce was often based on barter or trade. We also have the triangular trade, which I mentioned earlier, and this is the interaction between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And they kind of form a triangle. North and South America is seen as one. Britain passed a series of navigation acts, very important term to know, which required that colonists could only trade with Britain. It was a way for Britain to benefit from having these colonies. How on earth did the colonists get around this? They smuggled. See lots of smuggling. This guy's smuggling something. I don't know what. Looks angry. All right, in England, most people did not own property. However, that is not the case in the colonies. You have a pretty large number of people who actually do own property. The plantation started in the Chesapeake, again, Virginia and Maryland, and it's all because of tobacco. Plantations were very far from towns, and there were different governments that developed than in New England. You actually see on very large plantations, they're almost like mini towns, but the population is much, much smaller than you would see in a town in New England. Large plantations in some instances provided schools and chapels, so it's almost like a medieval manor, if you will. Plantation slavery. Most slaves, in fact, live on large plantations. It was a horrific life, to say the least. Slaves began to develop a unique culture, religion, and family structure as well. And the family structure, it becomes very important, especially when so often slaves would be bought and sold. They would rely on friends and family to help support and watch after families that were left behind when, say, a father or a mother was sold to a different farm. Very important rebellion to know, the Stono Rebellion. Please star this, mark this, know the Stono Rebellion. The APUSH exam loves to ask about this. This is near Charleston, South Carolina. In 1739, 100 slaves say, you know what, we're sick of being slaves. So they go and they steal some weapons, they kill many whites, and they try to flee to Spanish Florida. They are not successful. Many of them end up being killed. And as a result, every time we'll see a slave rebellion, you have to know this. Slave laws become more strict. So every time there's a rebellion, regular slaves are treated more harshly as a way to prevent future rebellions. Although there were some rebellions, most slaves actually just resisted slavery by running away. Most slaves were not violent whatsoever. They just ran away. Know the Stoner Rebellion, guys. Okay, the Puritan community, we're going back to New England here. The town played a huge role in daily life. They divided up land, provided fields, both individual fields and fields for everybody. We have a town meeting, or a town hall meeting, if you will, and these held yearly elections. And those that could vote would be males, landowning church members. So it's kind of a small group of society, but we do see some elements of democracy, even if it's limited to just males who are white landowning church members. The halfway covenant, this is one thing I don't think the book really explained at all here. The halfway covenant was a way to increase church membership because people were not attending church as much. That so the church decided that they will allow more people to join the church, but they would have fewer rights than full church members. So the idea of the halfway covenant is that increased church membership, but it sacrificed religious purity. In other words, more people were joining the church that otherwise might not have. If you want more info on this, check out my video Religion in the Colonies. Salem witch trials is a great example of conflict in New England during colonial times. This is hysteria throughout Massachusetts. And we see the Salem village and the town of Salem. We see the accused are triangles and the accusers are squares. See if you see any patterns that develop there. The accused, or the triangles, tended to be wealthier, widowed, and middle-aged women. And we notice that geographically, there's almost like a line separating the two sides here. The accusers tended to be from the east side, and the accusers tended to be from the west side. So this is a conflict of east versus west within Salem. And it also reflected religious and social tensions because many of the women were widowed and were single women who had property and power. And that was kind of scary to Puritans during this time. And most of the accused were independent, as I just said, which challenged Puritan society. Okay, let's talk about cities. A couple cities, New York and Philadelphia, were the first two largest cities to have over 25,000 people, which is quite a large number in the 1700s. They emerged as huge trading centers. Lots of trade would happen there, port cities, or near ports, I should say. They had established government, and new ideas began to emerge and spread from cities. There's lots of inequality throughout the colonies. The wealthy, no matter where they were, had increased power in churches and society, especially in the South, but really everywhere you saw the wealthy had a lot of power. Men often, or almost always, had more power than women, especially married women. Okay, some tensions between Protestants and Catholics in New France or present day Canada are developing. In Rhode Island, complete religious toleration for all, founded by Roger Williams. Jews could worship freely there. Westward expansion. The further west people began to move and the farther away from the cities that people lived, there was less of a influence of the church. So we had the Great Awakening. In the 1730s to 1740s, this belief that everyone can develop a new relationship with God. We have two main players. This guy over here, George Whitefield, and on the right, Jonathan Edwards. George Whitefield is this great orator. He was able to speak and convert many people, and Jonathan Edwards is credited with starting the First Great Awakening. He is also the grandfather of Aaron Burr, future assassin of Alexander Hamilton. Know that Jonathan Edwards had had a sermon called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," and he said that the road to hell was paved with the skulls of unbaptized children. Think about that; that's pretty intense. So if you had an unbaptized child during this time and you hear that, what's the first thing you might do? Go out and get your child baptized, which will increase church membership. So that's the whole idea here. We have new lights versus old lights. New lights are these new preachers like a George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, and the old lights are these older preachers who tended to have boring sermons. As a result of the Great Awakening, you need to know this. One of the impacts of it, one of the effects, is that new branches of Christianity begin to develop. So we do not see as much unity within the churches. We actually see a division because more churches are developing, more branches. The Enlightenment is a movement away from religion, a 1600 or 17th century and 18th century movement that focused on reason, not faith, in obtaining knowledge. And this is where you have John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, Voltaire, etc. And they helped undermine the power of traditional authority. They challenged these monarchs in Europe. And there's John Locke. All right, education. In Massachusetts, there was a law that required every town to have a public school, and this was passed in 1647. So you see, education plays a very large role in New England. And why are they so focused on education? So people could read the Bible. This is an influence of close proximity and religion. So if you have many families living in a town, you're going to want to educate them. It's easier to educate people in a town or a city than it is out in the rural areas, which is why in the South there was not as much education. Literacy rates were very high among whites, and in most or all instances, slaves were prohibited from reading. If you see a question about the founding of Harvard or some of the early colleges, chances are it's going to be that they were founded as schools for preachers. All right, let's talk about this guy, Ben Franklin. A couple advancements in science. We had the lightning rod, which Ben Franklin discovered with the kite, the key, and all that good stuff. The inoculation of smallpox was discovered, meaning that if you had a mild form of smallpox, you can actually get people immune to it, or you could give that strain to people so they would not be killed by a stronger form of smallpox. Some concepts of law and politics. John Peter Zenger trial. Star, circle, underline, highlight this bad boy. Definitely know this guy. He is a newspaper guy who criticizes a British official. He goes on trial. Now, according to law, he should have been found guilty because it was illegal to criticize a British official. However, what the jury finds him is not guilty, and the impact of this is that you are allowed to criticize government officials as long as it was true. So this is a huge advancement in the freedom of the press. Most colonial governments enjoyed self-government. We see this in Virginia with the House of Burgesses. We see this with town hall meetings in Massachusetts. So really, for the most part, and this is an example of salutary neglect, the idea that the British leave the colonies alone to kind of do what they want as long as they are making money. And the colonial legislatures were very, very powerful because they could be elected by the people. And again, this idea of salutary neglect, if the colonists were left alone as long as they were profitable. So the English kind of said, you know what, you can have your fun, you can have your own governments as long as you're making money, all is well. This will come to an end in 1763, as we will see. Okay, let's look at a couple past essay topics that were applicable to this chapter. So the first one from the 2005 Form B AP exam, geography was the primary factor in shaping the development of the British colonies in North America. Assess the validity of the statement of the 1600s. So you'd have to say, yes, this statement is true, or no, it is not, and explain why. And what jumps out to me is this whole idea of slavery. Why did slavery develop in the South but not in the North on a large scale? Because you have flat land in the South that is very favorable to growing crops, cash crops in particular, where that is not the case in the North. Another one, 2011, analyzed the origins and development of slavery in Britain's North American colonies in the period 1607 to 1776. That should start with Bacon's Rebellion, or at least play a huge role in that. Hopefully you will be able to answer these two essays more after watching this video. All right, that's it for me. Please take a moment if you have not already. Subscribe to my channel. Help spread the word. Throw this on Twitter. Throw it on Facebook. Throw it on Pinterest. Vine it. I don't know what that means, but give it a try. I appreciate you guys watching. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And have a good day, guys.